ask myself, what's the quality of the criticism that I would want to call your attention to or tell you about, report. And that quality is, I think, summed up for me in the word honesty. And I don't mean only that he acknowledges the limits of what he can say, though I do admire that in critics. It means something rather more positive. The honesty that's apparent in this book is a facing of very large and central issues. I'll name three of these issues that just show up in the first 25 pages or so of the book. You'll get a sense of what I mean. And I'm not quoting CK, I'm paraphrasing the questions in my own words. The first one is, why might one not wish to resist politically the forces of the state? Second one, has poetry recently lost the courage to examine critically the nature of the human? The third, how can a poet presume, as Dante and Robert Lowell did, to represent others, to take oneself to be the case, as CK puts it quite nicely, I think. CK engages these questions without the support of philosophical authority and without hedges or obscurity. He displays the courage to say all of what he means as a critic, the basis of his courage. What is that basis? I think the basis is that candor, but also attention to and affection for poems that other people have written. That is, he has no privileged resources. He claims no privileged resources and no privileged authority as a critic. He has access to the same resources that all of us do, too. I want to read just 2 sentences from an essay in this book. The essay is called Admiration of Form, and here are the 2 longer sentences. Only humans generate form, and only humans appreciate beauty for its own sake. What distinguishes the human from the non-human has to do with the unnecessary, the undetermined, the superfluous, all the characteristics of the beauty that arises from the logically absurd interactions of necessity and convention. And it is the lack of beauty in our lives that serves to warn us that we are being complacent about our experience, numb to our metaphysical hopes and limitations, and reflexive in our moral duties. I wanted to read these sentences as an instance of a critical aspiration to abstraction and also to clarity, but they also suggest what is very obvious in his criticism, that aesthetic pleasure is an inevitable counterforce to complacency, and that complacency is politically devastating. Political engagement and aesthetic pleasure are in no sense opposed for this poet critic. That's something that bears directly on the state of academic literary opinion, something that we might contemplate more fully than we're accustomed to doing. Please join me in welcoming C.K. Williams.
So after all that stuff about my political attention, say, I will confess that I took the opportunity of writing an essay that has absolutely nothing to do with that subject, because I've been writing poem after poem about it, and when I was presented with the opportunity to present a talk, I decided I would just talk about poetry as poetry, pretty much. So I hope I don't fail some of your expectations. The title of the talk is Odd Endings. Sometimes poets can be heard to speak of poems they've written as being like their children, that the connection they have to their work can only be likened to that intense in intimacy. One thing implied by this is that if anything like a flaw or imperfection should be perceived in their poems, it's completely incidental to the affection the poet feels towards them. I'll admit I've never used that analogy about my own work, but I realized recently that I do feel that way about some poems written by other poets, poems I consider indubitably significant, great, major, whatever my adjective of the day is. Those poems are indeed like my own offspring, in that they're somehow perfect, truly perfect, just as they are, even if I notice elements in them with which I might disagree. I even feel that way about certain poets, not many, but a few. They're so close to me, to my heart, to my being in the world, that if they have written poems I don't cherish as much as I might, it doesn't trouble me. These poets, too, like my own children, are beyond reproach. Perhaps recognizing this has allowed me to admit aloud that some of these inestimable poems and poets, in fact, do have not defects, but say blemishes. And I notice that often these blemishes occurred at or near the ends of poems. But because of the allegiance I feel to these poems, I've chosen to speak of their endings as odd, not bad or mistaken or unforgivable, but odd. I'll consider here several endings which are puzzlingly disappointing to me, dubious, unsatisfying. One, although only one, which seems plainly, inexplicably wrong, and one other whose finish I find brilliant, transcendent, but which still might be called odd in its utter unexpectedness and rightness. One of these poems, Wordsworth's Michael, seems out of balance in the way its narrative climax is structured. Another, Robert Frost's Out, Out, ends to me in a wildly inappropriate tone. I'll look at two poems which are absolutely essential to my very definition of poetry, but which seem to falter in their spiritual or philosophical conclusions, their resolutions. In a sense, they fail to deliver what they promised, or not in the way they promised it. Rilke's Duino Elegies and Eliot's Four Quartets. The poem I'll mention whose ending delivers a great deal more than its already brilliant promise is Philip Larkin's The Whitsun Weddings. I should probably confess here that there's a strong possibility I might be utterly wrong in my carpings and quibblings. It may be that I just haven't fully understood the poems yet, and that wiser students of their strategies will be able to set me straight, although I hope not right away after I finish talking. Wordsworth's Michael is considered rightly to be a key work in the development of both poetic and social attitudes of the early Romantic movement. In its depiction of the lives of a family near the economic bottom of English life, it is one of the first of what we might call socially analytical works, which bring the actual lives of the lower classes into serious literature. The poem, as I'm sure you know, is about a shepherd and his wife and son. But though Wordsworth does use the term once, nothing about them and the way they live has much to do with the ancient tradition of pastoral poetry. Those recountings of the leisurely doings of lyrically brilliant, sophisticated rustics entertaining each other with virtuoso celebrations of their elemental but not elementary vocation. Wordsworth's shepherd is characterized primarily by the realities of his very difficult vocation and by the scant security it affords. The poem's catalog of the hardships of the realities of rural life is rich in detail and atmosphere. There are many passages about the great labor such a life entails, the more or less constant expense of energy, and the enormous solitude of the shepherd's calling. The shepherd's precarious financial situation is treated at length in the poem. We learn that he inherited his small parcel of land with some kind of mortgage that took years to redeem, and a key element in the plot concerns a guarantee Michael once gave for a business affair of a prosperous nephew whose fortunes have declined, so that Michael now may have to give, quote, half his sustenance, quote, to make good on his pledge. Wordsworth's portrait of the shepherd and his family and their life is mostly positive and admiring. Although he doesn't scant the difficulties with which they're confronted, the mood of the poem is mostly positive, almost exultant. The characters are stoical, patient, and essential for Wordsworth's spiritual beliefs. They glory, for the most part, in being so deeply embedded in a life nourished and ennobled by their closeness to nature. The solitude Michael experiences in tending his flocks is tempered by his time with his devoted wife Isabel, and then by the son who comes to the couple almost biblically late in their lives. Much of the poem is given over to the upbringing and moral education of this much doted upon son, Luke. The early life and formation of the boy are almost idealized. It would be nearly impossible to imagine a more thoughtful and considerate upbringing than that to which Michael and his wife devote so much of themselves. The poem, of course, ends in disaster. The boy grows up, and when the family faces its financial emergency, he is sent to the city to be brought along by a relative of his parents, so he'll be able to earn enough to help prevent a portion of the family's land from having to be sold off, their only other recourse. There's a long passage of farewell in which Michael instructs his son to lay a cornerstone of a sheepfold with him, which he says will be a covenant between son and father. Then, in the light of subsequent events, there's a moving plea to him that if while he's away he's tempted by evil men, he should think of their moment together and, quote, God will strengthen him, unquote. Amid all fear and all temptation, Luke, I pray that thou mayst bear in mind the life thy fathers lived, who being innocent did for that cause bestir them in good deeds. The son leaves, and after a promising beginning in the city, he goes bad, takes to evil habits, vanishes into urban anonymity, and finally flees, quote, to seek a hiding place beyond the seas, unquote. The amount of space I've used here to recount what would seem to be a key element in the plotting of the poem probably seems a conventional compression of complex events in order to fit them into my exposition. The odd thing, though, is that this isn't a compression at all. I've used only slightly less words to describe the fate of the shepherd's son than Wordsworth does in the poem. The events which in ordinary narrative would seem to be the tragic turning point in the destinies of the poem's characters are encapsulated in the following few of the almost 500 lines of the whole. Meantime, Luke began, this is the quote, meantime Luke began to slacken in his duty, and at length he in the dissolute city gave himself to evil courses. Ignominy, how do you say that? Ignominy? Ignominy? Okay. There's these words that you write but you've never said. It's strange. Like Phoebe. Anyway, and shame fell on him, so that he was driven at last to seek a hiding place beyond the seas, unquote. That's all. Luke's entire destiny is brought down to these 5.5 lines of iambic pentameter. It's worth noting that earlier, 13 entire lines of the poem are dedicated to the description of Michael's household's lamp. In the structuring of the poem, there seems nothing untoward in this. It's a beautiful evocation of a revered household object. It serves to reinforce the mood of reassuring domestic stability. Quote, down from the ceiling by the chimney's edge, in our ancient uncouth country style, which huge and black projection overbrowed large space beneath, etc., unquote. In the poem's allotment of human drama, there seems something seriously awry here. And again, when before the youth leaves home, Michael reveals to his wife his intention to send their son to the city, Isabel is naturally upset but comforts herself with an extended memory, a fantasy really, about a poor parish boy from their neighborhood who has gone off to London to become, quote, wondrous rich, unquote. Her reflections about this other youth, whose story is at best obliquely incidental to the whole poem, continues for 15 lines. Yet the undoing of Luke's life, which is absolutely central, takes up only those few lines, and we never hear another word of him again. though the poem goes on to recount, albeit sketchily, the ultimate fate of the parents. The thrust of the real story of the characters seems for all intents and purposes to come to a stop right here. The first time I read the poem, I remember I checked to see whether there might have been a misprint in the edition I was reading, that some or many lines might have been omitted by a sleepy typesetter. Wordsworth, of course, especially in his early work, was a consummate craftsman, one of the greatest in English poetry, and there's surely a way to read the poem to account for its odd structure. It may be that Wordsworth felt his deeper purposes were already accomplished by what he'd given of his narrative. They would have had to do with the way his old shepherd's spiritual consciousness is sustained by his closeness to the greater rhythms of the natural world and his stoical dedication. He goes on for 7 years remaining of his life, continue to work on the sheepfold he begun with his son, though it's never finished. Or perhaps Wordsworth conceived of Luke's denouement as something like the deaths offstage of characters in Greek tragedy. But even in tragedy, there's always a messenger who elaborates at length on the awful out-of-sight goings-on. Still, no matter how I try to justify the poem's greater purposes, I find poor Luke's fate abrupt, amputated. An aside, there's another strange bit in the poem. Near the end, the narrator tells of speaking with people who had known Michael and, quote, what he was years after he had heard this heavy news, unquote, about Luke. The poem then says, quote, his bodily frame had been from youth to age of an unusual strength, unquote. Strangely, Wordsworth had used precisely the same words to describe the shepherd near the beginning of the poem. I can't think of any other major poem or any poem at all that has the exact sentence twice. That was just an aside. Another rural poem, which at first glance couldn't be more different from Michael, Robert Frost's Out, Out, is a much more abrupt narrative with a much more shocking, dismaying ending. The poem recounts a briefer story, which again concerns a young man, another farmer's son, whose destiny is also sad, in fact grim. And though the poem is apparently less fraught with ethical implication, what we might call its moral tone is strangely layered at the end with what seems to me an inappropriate resonance. The frame of the poem is the unremarkable rural life of a family. A young man is performing an ordinary farm chore, the cutting of firewood with some sort of power saw. Frost has an uncanny ability to create atmosphere and character in a very few words, and near the beginning of the poem he uses a lovely bit of description to reinforce the richness and lack of irrelevant complication of the idea, at least, of life on a farm. Quote, the buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset far into Vermont, unquote. The poem continues in this mood of what might be called kinetic serenity for some lines, but then there's an accident. The youth's hand is caught in the teeth of the saw. Frost intensifies the event with an unusually vivid metaphor, which at the same time adds a philosophical, even cosmological edge to the event. Quote, his sister stood beside them in her apron to tell them supper. Them is the saw and the boy. At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meeting, unquote. We are in a metaphoric universe here in which objects may have minds, in which the dire arbitrariness of cause and effect imply a dimension which, though not inherently good or evil in a moral sense, still has ferocities, systems by which the youth and all of us are subject to a violence which seems to have larger, though terribly malignant meaning. The rest of the poem goes like this, quote, but the hand, the boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know, big boy doing a man's work, though a child at heart. He saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut off my hand off, the doctor, when he comes. Don't let him, sister. So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing, and that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. There's such an unusual tone here. That so to begin with. What does Frost mean by using such a dry term in the midst of such dramatic, not to say traumatic events? I really don't know. Seamus Heaney uses the word, which he says is an ancient sort of well, to begin his translation of Beowulf, but there's no evidence that this is what Frost had in mind. Though I admire the writing of the poem's formidable precision and figurative force, quote, the watcher at his pulse took fright, quote, is a startling instance of Frost's often understated metaphoric ingenuity. I just don't understand what he's up to. And then those last two lines, no more to build on there. And that there are no characters specified in the poem until the accident beside the brother and sister until, quote, no one believed, they listened, unquote. There's a family implied by these plurals, but it's a family with a startlingly cool response mechanism and then a rather horrifyingly cold one. I really don't understand the dramatic function of these last lines. Are we simply to disregard what would have been the grief of the sister and the rest of any normal family and even the doctor? Is the implication that mere observers can never appreciate the anguish of the participants in such small tragedies? But the characters who would be there wouldn't be mere observers. Family never is. What possibly could be the affairs to which they turn in the face of such intimate horror? Are they some madly fanatic descendants of the ancient Stoics for whom, at least theoretically, the death of a loved one was of no greater moment than anything else? And what of the title? The association must be to Macbeth's out, brief candle in the famous Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow passage. Shakespeare's dark vision in those lines is tempered by their being so poetically luminous. But might Frost be experimenting with, or testing might be a better word, a similarly nearly nihilistic reflection? Might he be hinting that the implications of the tragic accident he recounts are simply overwhelming beyond even considering, and that the only appropriate response is to look away from the whole bleak reality in which such things are permitted to occur? This is surely the most tolerable possibility. Otherwise, the ending seems merely callous, cruel, nearly nasty. But I'm somehow not convinced. At least, though, if Frost had something in his own character like this, which his most treacherous biographer suggests, he managed to conceal it impeccably in the rest of his work. I really don't know the solution to this puzzle, though perhaps there's some clue in the fact that Frost modeled out on an article he came in on in a newspaper. But I don't believe that really explains anything either. Much literature is composed concerning matters with which the author has no real first-hand experience. And though there is in the abruptness of the tone at the end something akin to the turning of the page of a paper or the moving of the eyes from one column of print to the other, if that was Frost's purpose, he probably would have let us know about it in the poem himself, which he doesn't. As I say, perhaps there's just something about the poem I haven't understood, and if someone could explain it to me, I'd be grateful. As it is, the poem remains for me a kind of stain on the sensitive and generous person Frost is in the rest of his work. Rilke and Eliot now, whose odd endings are of a much different order. Rilke's Duino elegies, which many readers, myself among them, consider the greatest single poem of the 20th century, has a vast range of theme and an equally broad consideration of humanity's enduring dilemmas and their potential resolutions. From its beginning, that rapturous evocation of spiritual desolation, who, if I cried out, unquote, the poem moves in wider and wider circles, encompassing everything from religious impulse to love and sexuality, to a child's love for and from a mother and then a father, to a mythical aggrandizement of the overwhelming confusions of young love, to the profound connections between art and life, to the spiritual links poetry can find in nature, to. Thematically, the poem is simply gigantic, inexhaustible. At its deepest level, it concerns itself with what can be expressed intellectually about human life and what in our existence can be transformed to language and poetry and transfigured finally to what Rilke calls invisibility, by which he means a realm of existence grounded in our own but which is utterly different from ours in the ways it brings together the worldly and the metaphysical. Superabundant being, quote unquote, is what the poem finally proposes and in many ways accomplishes. Its primary method is a kind of transcendent metaphor, the bringing together of the most seemingly disparate phenomena and even categories of being in order to illuminate reality, but even more to create new modes of perception utterly unavailable to us anywhere else. And the poem is terribly moving. I remember my huge surprise when tears came to my eyes as I was reading aloud the beginning of the 8th elegy to a friend. It was the first time that had ever happened to me. I still find that passage embodies a completely unique way of experiencing non-human reality. Quote, with all its eyes, the natural world looks out into the open. Only our eyes are turned backward and surround plant, animal, child like traps as they emerge into their freedom, unquote. There are so many more passages it would delight me to read if I had time. The beginning of the 3rd elegy about young love and the existential forces of desire. The 5th elegy, which is based on Picasso's painting Les Saltimbanques, and is an extended meditation on art, using the street performers in the painting as the vehicles for a dazzling series of symbolic transfigurations, which both ennoble the figures in the painting and profoundly elucidate how we ourselves are enhanced by the realm of aesthetic display. And there is the marvelous fig tree of the 6th elegy and so much more. In some sense, then, when I speak of the ending of the Duino elegies as being odd, as having shortcomings, I might appear to be ungrateful, and I suppose in some ways I am. But the sense of disappointment with the poem's ending I felt the first times I read it, which then I put down only to my own lack of skill in reading, has stayed with me, and in some ways intensified over the decades I've been studying it. The last 10th elegy begins by looking back to the first. It too gets underway with an evocation of angels and continues in a large exultant tone, really a tone of poetic triumph. Quote, someday emerging at last from the violent insight, let me sing out jubilation and praise to assenting angels. Let not even one of the clearly struck hammers of my heart fail to sound because of a slack, a doubtful, or a broken string. Let my joyfully streaming face make me more radiant. Let my hidden weeping arise and blossom. Unquote. The poem goes on into a sentiment only Rilke could get away with, regretting, quote, how we squander our hours of pain, unquote. Of course, Rilke considered that his project of transformation would be incomplete if the recurring human phenomena of grief and anguish couldn't be part of it. In the section which follows, the poem recounts the devices human beings have generated to inure ourselves to our inevitable sorrows, a brilliant passage in which Rilke posits an angel who would stamp out our illusory comforts, and goes on to create a scene that embodies the contempt he felt for the deceptive trivialities by which we distort our lives to distract ourselves from our true obligations. The poem refers to a, quote, city of grief, where, in the false silence formed of continual uproar, the figure cast from the mold of emptiness stoutly swaggers, the gilded noise, the bursting memorial. Oh, how completely an angel would stamp out their market of solace, bounded by the church with its ready-made consolations, clean and disenchanted and shut off as a post office on Sunday. Quote, familiars of Rilke's biography will catch the poignancy here of a man who lived most of his intimate life writing and receiving letters, for whom a closed post office was a serious matter. Next, a passage that encapsulates with wild inventiveness the way our material productions distract us from our more difficult aspirations. Quote, farther out, though, the city's edges are curling with carnival, swings of freedom, divers and jugglers of zeal, and the shooting gallery's targets of prettified happiness, which jump and kick back with a tinny sound when hit by some better marksman. From cheers to chants he goes staggering on, as booths with all sorts of attractions are wooing, drumming, and bawling, unquote. Then one of my favorite moments in Rilke's work, perhaps because it's so un-Rilkean, which brings together the most crass of our false consolations, money and sexuality, quote. For adults only, there is something special to see, how money multiplies naked, right there on the stage, money's genitals, nothing concealed, the whole action, educational and guaranteed to increase your potency, unquote. There follows an excoriation of the illusions of inebriation, and the poem returns to the real, where people are visible and people are visible and lovers and even dog screwing. But now, some problems. The entity previously called the figure cast from the mold of emptiness becomes the young man, although there's been no indication that there's a young man here at all. Then a little farther on, again with no warning, we discover that the young man is dead and is all at once being, quote, drawn on further. Perhaps he is in love with a young lament, unquote. The whole elegy now swings to an evocation of this lament, who perhaps, quote, is of noble descent, unquote, but who the young man will abandon because, quote, only those who died young in their first condition of timeless equanimity while they are being weaned follow her lovingly, unquote. Being weaned? This is where my sympathies begin to waver. The young lament befriends young girls now and, quote, shows them gently what she is wearing, pearls of grief and the fine spun veils of patience, unquote. I don't really want to even try to diminish Rilke's outstanding accomplishment, but I, for one, just can't account for the sheer mawkishness of what comes now. Briefly, the young man finds an elder lament who recounts the history of the laments, who were once a, quote, powerful race, quote, and who used to be rich, as Rilke's many patronesses were. Then the young man is guided through the landscape of lament with its ruined temples and castles and, quote, fields of blossoming grief, unquote, which the living think are bushes. There are herds and birds and graves of elders and even the Sphinx, and the whole thing begins to sound like a 19th century fantasy novel populated by beings who have the anemic ephemerality of figures in bad pre-Raphaelite paintings. It's only at this point that we realize the young man is recently dead, and therefore is too, quote, dizzy, unquote, for his sight, quote, to grasp it, quote, presumably the Sphinx. Now there's an owl that brushes his cheek, quote, the one with the fuller curve, unquote. Then, quote, the new stars of the land of grief, unquote. A list of constellations, all, again, the most diluted late romantic glyphs, the rider, the staff, the garland of fruit, cradle path, etc., and last and surely least, quote, the clear sparkling M that stands for mothers, unquote. The weird story goes on a bit more until the dead youth alone now, quote, climbs on up the mountains of primal grief, and not once do his footsteps echo from the soundless path, unquote. The first time I taught Rilke in an undergraduate comp lit class, I took an extreme, though fortunately passing, dislike of both him and his poetry, all these delectations of early death, those of young girls particularly, even though they do come to be rich symbols in the sonnets to Orpheus. And this hapless dead youth wandering through his utterly unreasonable lament world didn't help. The elegy and the poem end in a passage for which the word anticlimax seems to have been invented. After all the thematic splendors of the poem, its absolutely unforgettable beginning, its rich elaborations of so much profundity, both ordinary and exalted, I always feel a shock of disappointment when I come to it. Quote, "But if the endlessly dead awakened a symbol in us, perhaps they would point to the catkins hanging from the bare branches of the hazel trees, or would evoke the raindrops that fall onto the dark earth in springtime. And we, who have always thought of happiness as rising, would feel the emotion that almost overwhelms us whenever a happy thing falls." And that's the end of the elegies. I realize that some of you probably haven't read the elegies or the four quartets. I should have sent them on ahead, I guess. I'm sorry, but maybe when you do read them someday. Is that all? That's all. The last elegy, to put it mildly, I find to be a muddle, poetically, philosophically, morally. As I said in my preface, not only doesn't the ending not deliver what the rest of the poem promises, if you're not attentive and perhaps tolerant, it can seem to contaminate and dilute the undeniable greatness of nearly everything else in this infinitely compelling work. Finally, it doesn't, though, because a poem isn't a philosophical system. It doesn't have to possess a systematic consistency from beginning to end. And I've sometimes wondered if in some ways I might love the poem more because of its frailties and the implication that the mind and imagination at work in it is merely human. Another work of great ambition that's been crucially important to me, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, shares Rilke's poem's largeness of purpose and even, in fact, its basic thrust. In another context, I've referred to both of them as inner epics, and that's as good a way as I have to describe the way both of them enact a sustained reflection on critical issues of life and spirit, as experienced by a single adventurous poetic imagination. Eliot's poem also shares with the elegies a rather anticlimactic ending, a resolution which doesn't seem, at least to me, to come close to fulfilling the intentions the poem has posited for itself. The beginnings of the poems couldn't be more different. Rilke starts with a cry to an angel, a proclamation, in a way, of the poem's spiritual purposes. There's also, of course, an implication of religion in the figure of the angel, although there has never been a religion quite like the one Rilke formulates. The quartets, on the other hand, begins famously in a tone of philosophical metaphysical meditation. Quote, "Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation," unquote. The poem will move even more than Rilke's into the realm of the religious and in a more definite way. But for now, the establishment of the poetic tone of Eliot's writing is more speculative than religious, with only that term, unredeemable, to give a clue to how the poem will elaborate its religious concerns later on. One critic characterizes the philosophical spiritual purpose of the poem as working out in poetic terms of, quote, "the immanence theory of time," unquote. Surely this is a very partial description of the poem's ambitions, but it does sound as though something like this is taking place, and the poem does concern itself with the function of time and speculative reflection and with elaborations of sense and memory that partake of and exalt the immanent. One of the central methods of Eliot's poem, like Rilke's, is to be radically inclusive, to touch on a great number of the themes and strivings of a soul that is conscious of itself, of its potential both for fulfillment and spiritual distraction. The matter that Eliot selects to embody his processes are quite different from Rilke's, as is his method of doing so. His poem is much more committed to quotidian details as ways of opening access to larger questions. The earthly places the poem refers to are much more definite and singular than Rilke's, for the most part generalized settings. If Rilke uses a fig tree almost mythical in its unspecificity, although it's actually in the garden of a hotel in Ronda, Spain, where I had my picture taken with it once. To speak of the way the soul can hesitate within itself before the project of illumination, Eliot uses details of contemporary England to concretize his spiritual quest. Quote, "The wind that sweeps the gloomy hills of London, Hampstead and Clerkenwell, Camden and Putney, Highgate, Primrose and Ludgate." The poem goes on to brood, "Descend lower, descend only into the world of perpetual solitude, world not world, but that which is not world," etc. It's interesting to contrast the long metaphoric passage I quoted from the Elegies about the crassness of the material world with something with a clearly similar purpose in the quartets, the famous dark, dark, dark passage. They all go into the dark, the vacant interstellar spaces, the vacant into the vacant, the captains, merchant bankers, eminent men of letters, the generous patrons of art, the statesmen and the rulers, distinguished civil servants, chairmen of many committees, industrial lords, and petty contractors all go into the dark. The lyric strategies of the poems, though, couldn't be more different. In detail and in large, Rilke in his poems seeks to distill articulated meanings from his meditations. Although the elegies are charged with images that are constantly heightened to the status of symbols, those symbols are always a portion of a poetic which, at least until the last, for me, doomed elegy, moves towards a kind of experience both spiritually numinous and intellectually accessible. The symbols the poem generates are not poetic ends in themselves. They are always moving towards a more direct intuition that incorporates them as a part of the act of meditation. Eliot's lyric passages, on the other hand, are less specifically determined. Their meanings, that doesn't seem the proper word here, are embodied or embedded in what Eliot himself defined as objective correlatives. The images and the passages of pure lyricism might be described as exciting meaning, hovering above meaning, participating in a much more oblique, though just as essential way in the larger purposes of the poem. We never find in the elegies the many passages of pure sustained lyrical evocation like the one that begins the last quartet, Little Gidding, unquote. Quote, "Midwinter spring is its own season, sempiternal though sodden towards sundown, suspended in time between pole and tropic. When the short day is brightest with frost and fire, the brief sun flames the ice on pond and ditches. In windless cold it is the heart's beat, reflecting in a watery mirror a glare that is blindness in the early afternoon," unquote. Although there are surely hints here of some of the symbolic energies with which Eliot has charged this poem, there's still a sense of deflection from its direct purposes, an elaboration that has as its intention the evocation of a series of profound emotional states by a reinforcement of atmosphere or mood. The term mood can too often be used in a way that understates how important its function in poetry really is, how able it is to reinforce modes of both intellectual and affective analysis. Both poems differ radically in their relation to religion as well. As I've said, Rilke's spiritual nomenclatures in the elegies bear little relation to any established religions. He may select various symbols, particularly the angel and the saint, from religious iconography and from his own early poetry. But beyond that, there isn't much more than the elemental aspiration for larger meaning and existence. Eliot, on the other hand, to emphasize his larger purposes, uses the lexicons of traditional religious speculation, mostly Christian, but also Buddhist and also indirectly various Indian religions. The following passage relies as much on reverberations from Eastern religion as on from conventional Christianity. Quote, "The inner freedom from the practical desire, the release from action and suffering, release from the inner and the outer compulsion, yet surrounded by a grace of sense, a white light still and moving," unquote. The amalgamation of different religion experiences allows Eliot to set up resonances between seemingly contradictory conceptions of spiritual consciousness, to fuse these visions with his imagistic clarity as well as his mastery of the cadences of meditation. His simulacra of the obsessive rhythms of prayerful chanting infuses his whole poem with a profound sense of metaphysical urgency. Rilke's and Eliot's poems are also alike in that a portion of their thematic substance deals with the psychic risk inherent in these terribly serious undertakings, and they both insist on the potential desolation inherent in the struggle for high spiritual undertaking. Again, though, they differ formidably in their articulation of this despair. Rilke's nights of anguish are the shucked-out midnights of failed poetic inspiration, while Eliot's unattained ecstasies are the exertions of a hypothetical mystic, even of a saint. Eliot's poem can be seen in some ways almost as a handbook of Christian mysticism, and there is in it always the implication that various kinds of anguishing ascetic renunciations will be required for the visionary progress the poem postulates. Even here, though, the poems differ in both the articulation of this spiritual anguish and its grounding. Rilke's poem is always moving forward with a kind of hopefulness. It continually posits a naive, almost childlike consciousness which is approaching the possibility of illumination for the first time. The past of the poem exists mostly as a repository of moments which are potential epiphanies which have been waiting to be brought back in a context that will allow them to blossom into their real richness. In Eliot, on the other hand, there's the sense that what is being attempted is the recuperation of other instances of the same project, of efforts wasted and energy having been uselessly expended. And there are many references to futile past ventures which must be effected again because there is no other choice. Compared to the elegies, there's a sense of weariness, of near exhaustion. This pattern of negation and renewed striving is in fact one of the poem's primary devices. There are many examples in the poem of paradoxes which are both grounds for despair, yet which illuminate. The notorious, "Our only health is the disease," for instance. There's an underlying dialectic, a tug-of-war between the desire for action and the sense of action's ultimate futility, a way of looking at acts that are obviated even as they're undertaken. Always the negation which inspires to greater striving, and always the undercurrent of a conclusion which implies that self, mere self, even the luminous poet self, is insufficient for the higher ends the poem proposes. There's a quote, I'll leave it out. All of this is a sketchy description of what Eliot is about in his magnificent work. Although at one point in the poem, Eliot says the poetry does not matter, and of course the poem reflects at great length on poetry itself and its own poetic methods in particular. The poem's greatness resides just in the fact that it is not ultimately a religious tract or a series of sermons or, as I have said, a handbook of mysticism, but a poem rich, complex, and various in both its theme and music. And it's this that leads me to describe the resolution of the poem, its ending, as another oddity. Perhaps I should repeat again that I believe the quartets, like the elegies, is a great poem. If I'm offering what seem like criticisms of both poems in the way they conclude, this doesn't affect my ultimate esteem for them. But I think that both poems at their very outset set spiritual, philosophical, non-poetical tasks or challenges that they don't and probably can't resolve. Rilke, from early in his poetic career, had a notion of spirituality that was grounded in something like a monastic ecstasy. The Book of Hours, one of his earliest works, is a dramatization of the devotions of a humble monk, but a monk who lived in medieval Russia or some imaginary vision of it. But the moment of history the poet actually was living in was terribly mundane. The years the poem took to write bracketed the cosmic horrors of World War I, and though Rilke's participation in and attention to that war was scant, the war's larger implications about history and culture were impossible to disregard. Perhaps it shouldn't be surprising then that the ending of the elegies abruptly abandons anything like a Christian iconography, even that single angel, and moves instead into something like an Egyptian or Grecian cult of the dead. The last passages of the poem evoke, in fact, some of the writing in the early masterpiece Orpheus, Eurydice, and Hermes. The problems with Eliot's poem are very similar to this in some ways and profoundly different in others. Four Quartets was written before and during World War II, and if that war is barely referred to in the poem itself, its historical and social reverberations were acute in the consciousness of the poetry. In his prose, Eliot shows himself supremely aware of the implications of both conflicts, though we may differ violently with his perceptions and prescriptions. On the other hand, in terms of the philosophical religious undertakings of the poem, Eliot's trajectory is almost precisely the opposite of Rilke's. The quartets begins, as I've said, with what sounds like a philosophical meditation, but by the end it has moved into a resolution which in its terminology depends almost completely on religious symbol. Quote, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crown not of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Now, scholars of the poem can no doubt describe its structure in a way to justify how it arrives at this strangely thin lyric murmur with its unconvincing echo of Dante. But for me, in terms of the poem as poem, I feel a serious letdown with this conclusion. Have all those intricate and weighty investigations of spiritual and secular consciousness arrived here in this rather truncated bit of Christian symbolism? Even musically, the end of the poem is irresolute. The last passage seems to be sung by the voice of a single violin, isolated from the highly chromatic chordal structure of the rest of the poem. There's certainly nothing wrong with this in principle, but the music is perfunctory, plaintive. Rhythmically, the last two lines are slack. There are 15 syllables in the last two lines, of which 6 are definite stresses, while in the first two lines of the poem, time present and time past are both perhaps present and time future, 9 of the 16 syllables are stressed. Stress in verse is energy. Energy is not at all what defines good poetry, but there's a kind of hesitation, almost a diffidence in these lines that make them seem inadequately musically as well as contextually to the largeness of the rest of the poem. Perhaps Eliot's ambitions, like Rilke's, were simply too large to be accomplished, or perhaps they were attempted at an inauspicious historical moment for such encompassing aspiration, perhaps in a century which had become so secularized and violent, and at moments of history which were so fraught with tensions and terrors, attempting to fuse so many historical and metaphysical yearnings would necessitate a coherent consciousness which is simply no longer available. I have a friend, a master carpenter, who once, while we were working together on some project that had gone infuriatingly awry, offered me a bit of wisdom I find often comes to mind. Nothing's easy. It might not be quite true that nothing is easy, but a lot of things aren't. And surely it's clear by now that ending poems is one of them. So I'll speak now of Philip Larkin's splendid The Whitsun Weddings, which, as I said, has an ending odd and in sheer unlikely splendor. The poem, as you know, takes place during a train ride from an unnamed city in England to London, and is a depiction of the environments the train goes through, as well as the small, touchingly well-observed human adventures the poet perceives on his journey. It's really a kind of instant sociological survey of the England Larkin lived in, raised to a level of utter poetic luminosity. The finish of the poem is, like some of the other poems we've looked at, completely unexpected and no way could have been predicted from the poem's progress. There's also, as you notice, an odd echo, I doubt whether it was intended, but who knows, of Rilke's last elegy. I'll quote the whole end of the poem. I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed. And as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close, and it was nearly done, this frail traveling coincidence, and what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightening brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain, unquote. I mention Rilke, of course, because of that sense of falling, but Larkin's use of it is utterly unlike Rilke's. But more important is that arrow shower. Where in heaven's name did it come from to resolve and conclude the poem so compellingly? There's nothing whatsoever in the poem that prepares us for it, for its sheer unforeseeness, its glorious inappropriateness, its absolute radiance. And that the arrow shower is sent out of sight takes our exaltation even higher, and its, quote, somewhere becoming rain, unquote, goes even beyond that. Somehow all the seemingly minor beauties of the poem, and there are dozens of them, are, to use Eliot's term, redeemed in the inexplicable pure inspiration of Larkin's genius. Perhaps a more humble spiritual grace than that which Rilke and Eliot so mightily strove for and failed to attain. This is, there's no other word for it, grace, nonetheless. Thank you.